If you want to be more effective in your work and in your life, and you'd like to have more confidence that you're meeting your intentions, this is where it begins. Welcome to Do Busy Right, helping you organize your information and manage your attention so that they work for you, not against you. We educate you and encourage you by discussing ways to be more effective, not more exhausted. Let's do busy right. Hi there. Today, it'll be useful for us to talk about a perspective on organizing principles. I think that in particular, when we organize things on a computer, we have ways to do it that sometimes we don't recognize. And I want to talk a little bit about the background of that. I want to talk about things that we can use, organizational parameters that we can use that we might not think about. And I think it's interesting why we wouldn't think about them. So what we're going to do is cover metaphors a little bit and how metaphors help us think about using tools, particularly computerized tools and information. Going to do a little bit of definition of information. We're going to talk briefly about personal information management and what its purpose is in our lives. And then we're going to get to these organizing principles. So I think your takeaway will be not just a little bit more knowledge about how to organize your stuff, but a little bit of a different way to think about computing, to think about how we think about things. So I think this will be interesting. I'll bring in a library example. I'll bring in, talk about Google a little bit, and I'll talk about my reading glasses. So all of these will be examples of the point that I'm trying to get across. And that point really is that we need to open our minds, I think, a little bit to how we manage information and to the perhaps limiting thoughts that we may have because technology is changing and the world is changing around us. So we'll get started in no particular place because all these ideas sort of work together. So I'll start out by thinking about information, and we'll define what I mean by information. Information is one of those slippery concepts. I did my Ph.D. in management information systems, so we thought some about what information is and how it behaves, because we've got to build systems to manage information. And if we don't understand how it behaves, then it's going to be kind of hard to build a system to manage it. And there have been, I guess, the kind of most clear definition is by Claude Shannon. And he talks about information as reducing surprise. You can also, I think most people think about information as increasing knowledge in some ways. My own definition is a little bit broader than that. And I would say information is ideas, thoughts, phrasings, pictures, music, content, if you will, either from ourselves, from our own brain, or from others. And by others, that includes websites and individual people, both. It's interesting when we look at information because that's really what my goal is for us to store, because I think particularly as knowledge workers, it's important for us to deal with information well because it's a primary input into what we do. So that definition of information kind of brings up the idea of metaphors. And when we think about metaphors, definitions are murky. So the definition of information, it's either really vague, like the one I gave you, or it's from a specific viewpoint or viewpoint. And that's Claude Shannon. And I think that there have been other thoughts. But anyway, metaphors help us think about the way things behave. And since we can't clearly define it, we rely on metaphors. Now, what we're trying to understand when we say how something works, that includes how it can be used And then that includes the notion of affordances. So a tool or an object has affordances. And if you think about a hammer, it has two very clear affordances. One is use the flat part to put nails into a wall or wherever you need a nail. And the other is use the claw part to pull a nail. But the hammer has other affordances. It could be used as a weapon, for example. It could be used to, break a pane of glass if you were locked out of your house. So the point is that a tool has many different affordances, and sometimes if we get imaginative, we can think of new affordances for a tool or any object in the world. So metaphors help us understand those affordances. So a rock, we look at a rock and we go, well, it's heavy and hard. What other things are heavy and hard? Well, hammers are heavy and hard. So can we use the rock the way we use a hammer? Could you pound a nail in with a rock? Maybe. So the idea of metaphors and the idea of affordances are pretty tightly linked to me. And then back to kind of the idea of information. So we talked a little bit about metaphors, and we'll get more into that in a minute. When we think about information, I want to bring up this notion of media-less-ness. Okay, so in many cases still today, but fewer and fewer as technology moves on its path, we controlled information through control of the medium or media that it was delivered or recorded on. And some pretty straightforward examples will help this make a little bit of sense. For example, if you wanted to have a copy of music in the 1980s, it sounds so last century. If you wanted to have a copy of music that you could play whenever you wanted to, that was a vinyl record. There were also tapes, cassette tapes, and even some 8-tracks were around then. CDs hadn't happened. But that was how you paid for music quite often, was you would buy a vinyl record. And in order to buy vinyl records, well, in order to use the vinyl records you bought, you also had to buy a turntable and an amplifier and speakers and all these different things. But the distribution of the music and really the ownership of the music was largely defined by ownership of the vinyl record. And once you owned, and that's the medium on which this recording was, well, recorded. And so if you wanted music in your possession so that you could utilize it whenever you wanted to, then you bought this platter of vinyl that really was a little bit delicate. You could get it scratched and such like, but also really only had one purpose, and that was to put it on a record player and put a needle on it and hear the noise that was on there. Other media-driven, I personally believe that social media is something of a misnomer because there is no medium for the social information to be delivered on, so to speak, or the medium is so abstract and disconnected that it doesn't really make sense to even talk about media. Anyway, if you think about magazines, newspapers, books, all of these items in our world are valuable because they contain information. Perhaps a blank book is valuable on its own. Valuable because they contain information, and we purchase the item so that we possess the information or possess a copy of the information. And that goes to kind of this notion of information. We want to possess information because we want to use it on our own terms. And possessing information is kind of an odd notion because information is not possessed the same way a physical dollar bill is possessed. So if I have a dollar bill in my pocket and I see you and I give you my dollar bill, then you now have a dollar bill and I have no dollar bills. Where the often used metaphor of information, here we are, information as a flame on a candle. And if I have a lit candle and you have an unlit candle, then I can share my flame with you without losing my own flame. In other words, we now have two flames. And information is generally considered to be similar. Knowledge is often, that metaphor is often used for things like information and knowledge. But even though possessing information does not mean that it's the only instance of that information, the only copy, if you will, of that information, it is something that we want to do. And this is a learned behavior because we had to own something physical in many cases, in order to have the information available to us. So this actually might not go the way you think it's going to go as I'm talking, because one of the things that I'll argue is I hear a lot of people say, why do I need to organize it when I can just search for it on Google? And similarly, why do I need to possess a copy, in this case, of information when it's out there and I know Google can find it for me? And I would say there's kind of two reasons why we want to possess information. One is they're kind of both. Well, in fact, since there's two of them, I'll deal with that more later. But just thinking about the idea of possessing information, and we as human beings like to possess the information. We'll talk a little bit about why coming up. Now, we touched on metaphors. So we've got information. I've said everything that's germane about information for our conversation now. We use metaphors to think about anything that's murky, and information, the definition is murky. It's media-less, moving to media-less in almost every case. Now that our computers can represent it, it comes to us in bits, okay? And it's mostly media-less. I understand that the information is represented as a series of bits that's copied onto a magnetic drive somewhere in your machine. And then this notion of possessing information and why we do that. All right, now we'll switch over to metaphors, and particularly metaphors in computing. So I said earlier that we think about metaphors as a way to help us understand affordances, particularly when definitions are murky. And so we think in terms of metaphors. So when we look at the modern computing environments, there are specific metaphors that operating systems and other software applications utilize in order to present their affordances to us, or in order for us to be able to visually manage something that's as abstract as is information. And if you look at your operating system, both Windows and iOS operating systems utilize the document, file, folder, file cabinet metaphor for their storage. So you have, and in fact, this is even represented in some of the icons that we now use. So many document icons look like a printed version of what the document is. The Word icon has little squiggles on it, like lines on a piece of paper, and the Excel icon has a little grid on it, much like a spreadsheet. And so we think, when we use a computer, we think in terms of documents. And to be fair, there has to be a metaphor, because the murkiness of information and what it is and what constitutes a unit of information beyond just the bit, right? What constitutes a unit of information is very, very murky to us. So we have to have metaphors. And we have these, and these are fairly, well, they're well-known metaphors, but they're fairly, some of them are quite ancient in origin. Others of them not so much, but paper's been around for a long, long time. And manila folders and file cabinets both came into use, as memory serves, in the late 1800s. So these things have been around for a long, long time, certainly a long time relative to the speed of changing in computing technology and in office technology. But these metaphors persist. And here's where I'm going to talk a little bit about perhaps where metaphors, a specific metaphor, might be better or worse than another one. So if we think about information on a computer as living in a document, or a file is sort of like a document, but specifically thinking about a document, then that brings in all kinds of other thoughts about what a document is and how it behaves, and thus how we need to deal with it. So metaphors that we use. So a document historically has been a thing on paper. And those metaphors, and this may be an aging thought. It may be that younger generations at some point will not think of it this way. And it may be that some people don't think of it this way now, but I certainly think of it this way, which is paper is a document. And it's one or more pages. If it's more than one page, then the pages are somehow attached together, often with a staple or a binder clip or something like that. And it's interesting because if we use a paper document as the metaphor, then our thinking about affordances is based in physical reality. And in this case, that's very, very interesting because a physical reality, a piece of paper has certain limitations. One of those is a piece of paper that contains information, a piece of paper as media, has a physical existence. A piece of paper can only be in one place at one time. And that can leak out of that metaphor into our minds. Okay, so for example, I think most computer users will say, I only need one digital copy of any particular file. And by extension, that multiple copies of a file are in some ways bad. Okay, now that can be a fairly nuanced thought. And there are certainly areas when multiple copies might be bad. So one notion is this idea of, well, more than one copy takes up space. Well, I'll deal with this more directly in a minute, but that's certainly true. But I'll later talk about, well, that might not matter anymore, or at least as much as it once did. And then this notion of a piece of paper can only be in one place at one time means that, the other instance of multiple copies is a work in progress. So multiple copies of a work in progress. And if you've ever jointly authored any document with any other people, you recognize that we can get in trouble if multiple people make changes to, well, any document or any computer artifact. If multiple people are making changes to it at the same time, then that can produce the challenge of merging those multiple versions of the document. So version control really has been a function of there's only one, even in the digital world, there's only one version of the digital artifact that is being modified at any one time, and we swap that around rather than each of us having our own copy. Now, more recently, we've gotten into real-time editing. And so things like Google Doc and Word documents and those things can be edited by multiple people at the same time, but that requires some coordination. It's not a natural function of the computing that we do. So can be done, but that's another example. So, I guess the point for metaphors is they can age, they can fall out of date. I think we've talked about a couple of things that really kind of either are or have fallen out of date about paper. So one is, multiple copies of something take up space that they don't need to take up. Well, that's certainly true in paper. Is it also true, or is it also important in computing? And the second is, well, multiple copies can get into versioning problems. Well, that certainly has been true, but it's becoming less and less true as technology develops and begins to address these problems. So we should be able to change metaphors, but the metaphors get locked in, for example, to the way they're locked into the operating system. And if you try to change the file cabinet, folder, subfolder, document, file metaphor in an operating system, a lot of people would really be unhappy about that change. So they get kind of locked in. And my point coming up is that in some ways could lock in our thinking. So we need to be, analytical about our metaphors. So now we've talked about information and we've talked about metaphors in computing. So now I want to talk a little bit about personal information management, which is a subject that is near and dear to my heart, as you know, since you've been listening to this podcast. So personal information management, and this kind of talks back to when we were defining information. So there's really a couple of kind of critical parts of personal information management. And this has been defined by other people. William Jones at the University of Washington is a great source of information, or has been a great source of information, and has written much on personal information management. So I get this from him, at least the terminology. So there's two important facets of the personal information management process that concern us here. So the title of one of Jones's books is Keeping Found Things Found. And in this book, he talks about personal information management, but specifically he talks about the difference between finding and refinding. And it's actually kind of an interesting distinction between the two things. And it goes back to some of the things I talked about before. Finding, in his vernacular, is becoming aware of and probably taking the step of possessing some piece of information. Finding can be done multiple different ways. We can, the word finding might not be great because sometimes information is thrust upon us, and finding implies kind of a search process and an intent to go out and look for something, where sometimes we're not looking for information, but it's critical information and it slaps us in the face. But anyway, so that's what finding is: becoming aware of and probably possessing information. Now, as we possess it, we've got to possess it, and this may be metaphorically as well. We've got to possess it somewhere. In other words, if we're going to possess the information, then we need a copy, and that copy has to be somewhere in order to be in our possession. Okay, it can't be, well, I guess it could be, but anyway, you get the idea. And so we find internet information, we possess it, and in the act of possessing it, we put it somewhere. Now, a lot of information that we find and possess is not immediately useful to us at the moment that we find it and possess it. We all read general information We read books that may have some things that are immediately applicable to us, like today, but we have other things in the books that we want to record and think about in the future, all these different sorts of ideas. And so then this refinding, okay, we possess a lot of information. And so much so that when the time comes to utilize a piece of information, then we engage in a refinding process. Now, this finding and refinding, it's a metaphor for ways that we deal with physical things as well. Okay, we don't use finding and refinding, but if we add in the notion of possessing, so if you need an object in your life, say reading glasses, and I'll get back to reading glasses in a minute, so it's on my mind. Think about reading glasses, you don't you may not have reading glasses, and so you go get them at a store, you go buy them and possess them. Okay, so that's the finding sense, and you select among maybe many different options to get the ones you want, and then you go to pay the people, and however that works. But then you possess one pair of reading glasses. Okay, well, you bring them home and use them, and then you put them somewhere because you can't keep everything you own on your person, right, in your hands all the time, and so you put them somewhere. And then there's an instance of needing the reading glasses. And so you may very well have to engage in finding, which is actually refinding in the information metaphor. So you have glasses, just like you have a information piece that says what you are interested in it saying, or you possess a file that is a song you want to listen to. So you have found it and possessed it, but now you have to refind it. Okay, so information in our personal store is very much like this. So refinding. Finding is becoming aware of and possessing, while refinding is accessing for a purpose. Now, these two can get blurry because sometimes we do actively search. We do actively go out to find something, to become aware of information. Now we go search Google, or we look up a topic in Wikipedia, and we're actually actively finding information at that point. So they do get kind of blurred over, but I think that's as much a language thing as it is anything else. So the notion of finding and refinding. So earlier when we were talking about information, we talked about possessing. I think a lot of people have this notion of, why should I possess the information? Why should I bother to store my own copy of the information when it's available via Google search whenever I need it? And I would say the reason to do that is in order to make your space smaller for the search required when you refind. So just like your reading glasses, okay? It is certainly possible for you to take your document down to wherever you're going to buy reading glasses, get some reading glasses off the shelf, read your document, put the reading glasses back on the shelf, and carry your document back home. Okay? Horribly inefficient relative to the purchase price of reading glasses. So most of us do it the other way around. We go buy reading glasses so that we possess them, and it lowers our cost of acquisition. So in the same way, possessing a copy of information, regardless of how much information you store, you possess, it is a tiny fraction of all the information available. So when you possess it, you act to make your search space smaller when you go to find it again. And this is pretty valuable, because if you think about using Google, then we would say, okay, well, trying to become aware of some information. So I'm engaged in finding. So I do Google search and I find some information that suits my purpose. And I go, okay, that's great. Well, I'm going to use it now, but I'm also going to use it next Thursday. Now, many of us would then possess the information. Possess as a verb. Take action to bring it into our personal information store. But some of us would say, oh, well, it's out there. Why should I bother possessing it? And then next Thursday, they go out and they do Google search. And Google search is great. I love Google search. The problem with Google search is that, as yet, it does not understand the concept of, oh, and I want the version I read last Thursday. So a Google search won't return that. So and in my experience, unless you remember some particularly unique fact about the information that you found, it's very difficult to get back to that information. The same Google search term might return results in very different order. And it can be, and this happened to me in my research for the PhD. So I'm researching these academic journals and I'm looking and I'm seeing a document and it's like, okay, well, a PDF in this case. Okay, well, I read it. Oh, that's a very interesting document because I can use it in these following ways, sometime from it. So great. So in some cases, I did not possess the PDF. Some of them were, for example, quite expensive to download. And so I thought to myself, well, I'll find it again. And in many cases, the refinding exercise was very challenging, despite the fact that, it's a fairly small search space. Academic journal articles are a relatively small search space. But even then, finding that specific version of the information that I want could present a challenge. And so possessing is functional in not just in a security sense or a comfort sense, but also in a, making the search space, the refinding search space very much smaller. Okay, so we've talked about information, and particularly with information, we've talked about the idea of media-less-ness and this notion of possessing information. Okay. In many ways, media-less-ness has made possession much easier. In just about every case, media-less-ness has made possessing cheaper. So, information, media-less, and this notion of possessing. We talked about metaphors. We talked about metaphors specifically in computing. We talked about metaphors based on physical artifacts, files, folders, file cabinets, documents, these ideas, and the challenges of those metaphors, specifically those, but in general, the challenge of metaphors. And then we talked about personal information management, particularly with respect to finding and refinding. And then this notion of possessing as aiding us in refinding. Okay. I did promise to talk about space. I will say very briefly that some of our thinking around computers is based on space limitations that really no longer apply. There have very seldom been technology things in the human world that got as cheap as quickly as computer storage space. It's not quite free, but it's pretty close per usable unit. Okay, now I understand that, as we have more and more storage space, A, we store more and more stuff, and B, our information units get larger and larger and larger. Back in the day, a Word document file size was measured in, if not bytes, then certainly in kilobytes. Okay. Now, with all the different features and all the different bits and pieces that have to be stored, it's a much larger file. So I understand that. At the same time, I mean, you can buy a terabyte of externally driven USB storage capability for about $100. And a terabyte is a ton of storage space. So enough said about that. And storage space is one of these ideas that we carry forward without analyzing carefully, I would say. And so come to think of it, I do have kind of an amusing example of metaphors and how they work and how they may interfere with us. And I think maybe I will save that for the end of the talk here. I'm actually going to make a note while I'm recording this, so don't get offended on that meeting. Okay, so organizing principles. So we're kind of back to, okay, what does all this mean, right? So we've summarized our thinking thus far. What do all these facts mean? So I would say, first, when we think about organizing, we're thinking about the act of putting something in a location, or location's a little tricky here, or giving something properties in direct acknowledgement of refinding it. Okay, so if you have a collection of books, right, you got a physical artifact, you store it somewhere because it has a physical reality, assuming you don't throw it out, you store it somewhere. That place is a bookshelf. And then the books on your bookshelf may be organized such that you make refinding a simpler, faster, cheaper process. So your books may be organized alphabetically by type. Okay. If you're like me, you have different genres, and my different genres generally tend to be stored in different physical locations. Your bookshelf may have one shelf for nonfiction, one shelf for fiction. That's the kind of idea here. And so organizing is the act of putting something or giving something parameters so that you can easily or quickly refind it when you need it. And then the other piece of that is you can ignore it until then. In other words, you put it away where it doesn't bother you. And so then ideally, when we organize something, not only would it be a place that doesn't bother us or get our attention, but it would also be a place where we can find it when we need it. And ideally, it would present itself to us at our point of need. That's what's magical about the room of requirement in Harry Potter, is you go to the room and it presents to you the thing that you needed, whether you knew about it or not. Okay. And this would be a great future state for our information to jump out at us when we need it. We're not there yet. So that's the definition of organizing, and why do we do that is so that we can minimize our search costs when we refind it. So, and we talked about possessing, and we talked about researching as refinding, and some pros and cons about that. And that's why we need to organize, is because we possess in some ways. So when we think about those metaphors and we think about how that causes us to think about some of our information, I'll say artifacts, for lack of a better term, some of our information units. We talked about this notion of saving space, and we talked about this notion of a paper document can only be in one place at one time. Well, if our organizing principle is to put it away until we need it, and our goal is for it to jump out at us, then our organizing principles need to include that. So I'll say a couple of interesting perhaps organizing principles that are used in other areas that may be useful to replicate in our personal information management system that may not occur to us because of the metaphors that are typically associated with pieces of information on a computer. I hope that made sense. So, organizing principles. One is, I will say, I mentioned reading glasses earlier when we were talking about possessing. And here's an interesting thing, and I'm not the only one that does this. I have friends who do it as well. So I'm at an age where I need reading glasses. Actually, I have been for some period of time now. I won't talk about how long, but I need reading glasses. They make reading easier and faster. And I read a lot, and not just for reading, but for other up close work. Even if it's up close physical work or things like that. Using one of those little tiny screwdrivers, for example. Sometimes setting my watch, for example. So I have a need for reading glasses in lots of different physical locations. And so I had a pair of reading glasses, and I got really, really frustrated about the notion that every time I needed them, they weren't where I was, and I'd have to get up and go look for them because they could be in any number of different places. And if you're interested in more detail, you can find an episode where we talked about the notion of searching for something that may be in one of multiple locations and how challenging that can be. But we all know how that works. So reading glasses are pretty cheap. If you order them online, you can get them for, I don't know, $3 a pair. And so I went out and I bought myself, I think I currently have 5 pairs of reading glasses, with the idea that now they can be where in more places where I typically am when I need a pair of reading glasses. I mean, there's nothing special about them, they all kind of look the same. And it's not a fashion statement on my part. So I just have some reading glasses, I put them on, I'm able to do what I want to do. But I have several pairs of reading glasses, so multiple copies of the same artifact. And I have a pair that sits on my desk. I have a pair that sits where I read. I have a pair that live in my briefcase so that I can really lower the search cost for this thing when I need it. Well, that same notion is easily available to us in the information space, because nothing's cheaper than having multiple copies of the same piece of information. I understand licensing and I understand ownership rights, but except for that now, let's ignore that for now. So if I've created a PDF, say a transcript of this podcast, it's not going to change. So is it possible that I could, in order to better organize and more reduce my refinding costs, could I have multiple copies of that PDF in multiple locations in my storage? Well, the answer is sure. Nothing that prevents me from doing it. But I think most of us would say, kind of automatically, oh, well, multiple copies is a bad idea. Well, some people would say having multiple copies of my reading glasses is a bad idea, but it's a widely accepted concept, So that's a thing to think about. So is the cost and the overhead of multiple copies worth it in how much it reduces the refinding effort and cost? So that's one way that I think, as we perhaps say, use different metaphors to think about these things, that we can see different affordances and use these things in such a way as to lower our cost. I'll give you another example of a way to lower search cost. So we have this notion of pointers, and pointers is a computing term, as far as I know, that comes from some decades ago when we needed the concept. Now the concept is largely abstracted away in computer programming. So there's probably people out there still engaged in the use of pointers, but it's kind of gone away a little bit, or faded into the background of programming furniture, so to speak. So a pointer is not at all a mysterious idea. So it's a thing that shows you the location of another thing, like a pointer dog. And we may think of this as somewhat esoteric because we're highly aware of it under another name, and that other name is a card catalog. And so a card catalog in a library is, so what's its purpose? Okay. Its purpose is to help us find or re-find a specific book. A book is a physical object and has a physical location. There are good reasons to not have more than one copy of a book or more copies than you need, because many libraries have multiple copies of certain books. But there are good reasons to only have one copy of a book. Books are expensive, they take up space, et cetera, et cetera. And so in order to aid our finding and refinding, we develop a card catalog. So a card in a card catalog is a very small, very inexpensive representation of the book. A card in a card catalog typically has the book title, the author, just some information about the book, and it has a very important but quite cryptic number on it. And that number is a reference to the Library of Congress book storage system, and thus to the location of the book within the library. Well, I don't understand the Library of Congress book organization scheme, and I would suggest that many people don't. Those who are librarians, thank you for understanding this system, so the rest of us don't have to. And so we have the notion of a card catalog. Okay, great. It changes your perspective on a card catalog if you realize that years ago, when card catalogs were physical, that a library would have multiple card catalogs. And by that, I don't mean multiple drawers in a cabinet. I mean, they would have 3, as I recall, different card catalogs. So one card catalog represented every book in the library. It had a card for every book in the library. Perhaps not for multiple copies, but who knows? Anyway, generally. And the cards were organized by author name, alphabetical by author. They had another card catalog where the cards, the exact copies of the other cards, or close enough, were organized by book title in alphabetical order. And then, as I recall, there was a third card catalog that was organized for reasons that I don't understand by publisher name. And so if you knew the title of the book, but not the author, you could have a pretty good chance of finding it. And if you knew the author of the book, but not the title, you had a pretty good chance of finding it. And so that helps flesh out the idea of pointers, because the cards were very similar. They were just in 2 different places so that they could be organized according to different structures, and thus make it easier for us to find the book that we were looking for. Piece of cake, right? So now, card catalogs at the time were physical, and we've certainly gone beyond that with computerized card catalogs and the advanced search mechanisms that are available in those, and that they still produce the same number that the paper ones produced, which is the Library of Congress, or perhaps Dewey Decimal, number for the location of that book. But the fact that there's more than one of them shows the utility of pointers. So a pointer is some very inexpensive reference to the location of something else. And since they're very inexpensive, you can have multiple pointers. And then those multiple pointers can be in multiple places, metaphorically speaking, so that we can find stuff, reduce our refinding cost. So this notion of, can we have multiple copies of an information item? Yes, we can. Technology supports this. It's so cheap. Okay. There are areas where we don't want to do it for other reasons, but we can have multiple copies. And the other is this notion of pointers, which computers support. For example, in systems like Evernote, Gmail, and some other systems, there's the idea of tags. And tags conform more closely to the definition of a pointer than folders do. So if you have tagged an item and can search based on a tag, then that's similar to the notion of different card catalogs. And you can put those tags, if you will, in multiple locations, and they point back to a single location for the item that you're looking for. So here we are. So we've come to the end of this kind of long discussion that involved a couple of pretty unusual concepts. So I'll do a little bit of a recap and a summary. So when we think about information, we got two ideas away from our discussion of information. One is possessing information and why we might want to do that. Well, we might want to have our own information stored. We talked about media-less-ness of information and how back in the day, almost all information was represented through media or a medium. And then we possessed copies of the media-based information by possessing an instance of a physical object. Now that's gone away. Most information is now, I would say, in a high state of media-less-ness. We talked about metaphors. We talked about how metaphors can inhibit our thinking to some degree, particularly if the metaphors are aging. And I use the example of the metaphors that we use in modern computing operating systems that have to do with, files, folders, file cabinets, and documents, and how that can limit our thinking about the affordances of those information artifacts. We talked about personal information management, and we talked about finding and refinding and how those are different things. And the idea in personal information management is to make refinding easier. And so that's a reason why we might want to possess information as compared to not possessing it. And then, we talked about organization and principles of organizing that were formerly not useful, particularly with the notion of physical information artifacts, but are now available to us because of the media-less-ness of our information. In many cases, we've abstracted information away from physical media. And that's computing technology and internet technology and all these different things. But we still have these now aging, these media-based informational metaphors that can cause us to make certain assumptions about how we could or might be able to organize our information. So just really, I guess at the end of the day, if you're a tips and tricks person, then I've given you two. So I've talked about having multiple copies of something, informational artifacts, and I've talked about the notion of pointers that are often represented in modern computing with the notion of tags. Okay. And tagging, in good tagging systems, tagging can be utilized in search such that tags can act like folders. But in most of the same systems, folders cannot act like tags. And the thing that will tell you the difference is that typically folders, a artifact in that system can be in one and only one folder at any one time, while it can have multiple tags. And those tags can make the information item appear to be in multiple locations at the same time, much the way pointers work in the, for example, library card catalog. So I think we can take away some of that. The other takeaway is kind of a bigger picture, which is to perhaps, as you have the opportunity, think about metaphors in our world and think about whether those metaphors are accurate, whether they've begun to age, and how applicable they are, particularly when it comes down to inventive thinking, when it comes down to creative thinking. One of the best ways I'm aware of to think creatively is to look for affordances in common objects. And you may have participated in an exercise like this. So you sit down, you've got 5 minutes, and think of how many different ways you could use, say, a car key. And you just write down as many ways as you can think of. And so that's really thinking about the affordances of a physical object. And sometimes when we're in creative thinking, building, engineering styles of thought, then thinking about those affordances can be helpful. And thinking about the affordances helps us to some degree analyze metaphors that we have for most common objects. So I hope this has been intriguing to you. In addition to being useful for you. I think the final thing I'll say is that this is the kind of thought that went into creating the storage system that supports attention compass. And we use these kinds of organizing principles in that they're incorporated into the tool. And so people often ask me, well, can I do attention compass on platform X? And I go, well, sort of. And in some way, it relates to what their metaphors are around tagging and around multiple copies. And can we use these additional organizational tools, again, judiciously, in order to give us better organization, and better organization defined as lower refinding cost. So that's a lot, pretty complex, a lot of different ideas coming together to support one line of thinking. I'll leave it there for now. This is Larry Tribble, Ph.D. Thanks for taking some time to improve your task and information management on the Do Busy Right podcast. The show is dedicated to helping you think about how to get better at working. And we do this by improving your attention and your focus. I believe that your work is not just about your job, but about all the tasks that you do to turn yourself, your environment, and your relationships into what you want them to be. What we're really talking about here is the underpinnings of becoming who you want to be. The primary way I help people is through coaching the Attention Compass process. Attention Compass is 4 workflows and a tool set that support our information, task, and attention management. I help people with big goals to build habits that put them in a position to achieve. We do this by eliminating wasted time and wasted attention. If you'd like to know more, you can find me on LinkedIn or go to dobusyright.com for more information. Have a good week, more effective and less exhausted. Do busy right.